everyone, welcome to your lecture on reading academic journal articles. We probably already went over this in class if you're listening to this, about how to find them, but today I'm going to break down how to read them because we usually talk about how confusing it might be or how long they might be. So hopefully this strategy will help you work smarter, not harder, as you're getting through these articles for your research paper. So this lecture is going to cover what makes an article academic or scholarly. When I say an academic article or a scholarly article or a peer-reviewed journal article, this is what I'm referring to. We're going to talk about why these sources are challenging, how to approach the articles, how to break them down, and how to read them efficiently. So we're going to get started here. So what is an academic journal article? An academic journal article is peer-reviewed, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide, so I'm going to get into that. But you do peer review during class, so it's kind of similar to that, just in a more formal way. Academic journal articles are also published in scholarly journals that require a subscription. So they're not just available on Google usually. Google Scholar does have some, but they don't always have the full text. So it might not be as comprehensive as what we have in the library. So they're not typically found in those free search engines. But they are periodicals. So they are published, as the name indicates, periodically. It might be yearly, it might be quarterly, twice a year. It really just depends on that journal and how they publish. These are written by experts. They're usually written by people with advanced degrees in their field. Oftentimes they work out of a university or an organization. So these are not just people off the street, so to speak, writing these articles. These are people who have gone through rigorous education in their field to get these credentials. So they're also writing for that audience. They're not writing for college students. That's not who they have in mind when they're creating these articles. They have in mind other scholars in their field. So what does peer reviewed mean? So we do peer review in class, right, where you get a peer's paper and you provide them feedback to make it better. It's basically the same thing. It's just a lengthier process. It's not just improvements to the paper or to the article. It's also making sure that the article isn't overlapping somebody else's research, that it's not plagiarized either intentionally or accidentally, making sure that the evidence that the person is presenting is valid and sound, and that there were no errors in the study, there's no ethical issues, things like that. So basically the process in a nutshell is that, someone writes an article and they submit it to a journal for publication. The journal sifts through the articles, decides what they want to publish in the next journal. If they decide they're going to publish your article, they send it out to other peers in that field. So for example, my area that I study is community colleges, specifically developmental education. So courses that would sometimes be called remedial. I don't like that word, but if you need a little bit of context, the courses that don't typically count towards graduation but help prepare students. So I want to write an article about developmental education. I send it to Higher Education Quarterly, and they say, this is great, we want to publish this, but we're going to send it out to some other people first. So they're going to send it out to other people who also study developmental education at the community college level, and they're going to evaluate my article, provide some feedback, and make sure that there's no problems with it. After that happens, they send it back to the journal sends it to me, and then I make the revisions and resubmit it. And then the editor will eventually decide after those revisions whether or not to publish the article. So this is why it takes scholarly articles a long time to come out. This is a very lengthy process. Not only writing an article takes a long time, it can take, a year or two to do a study and get it approved and write the actual study up and do the findings and all of that. Your own writing process, plus it has to get sent out to all these people. So you might read an article from 2015 that the study was actually done in 2012. And we know that in today's world, information is constantly changing. So the peer review process, it does slow down how fast things are published, but it makes sure that we only get the best information. So just keep that in mind if you're reading an article, even if it says 2020 on it. The study wasn't done this year. It might have been done 2 or 3 years ago, prior to this being written. So some challenges of using peer-reviewed articles, we may or may not have started talking about this. The biggest challenge is that they're written by experts for experts. So they're using jargon from that discipline. So for example, if I'm writing about developmental education, I might talk about placement testing, and some of the words that I use would be like accuplacer, multiple measures, score ranges, things like that. ALP is a word that I would use, which is accelerated learning program. So if you don't know those words, you have to look them up. But people in my field who also study developmental education know what those words mean. They don't have to define them for that audience. So they're going to use words that are specific to that discipline. If I was, when I write about literature, I use, if I'm talking about a symbol, I'm not going to explain to my audience what a symbol is. I'm assuming that hopefully other experts in literature know what a symbol is. But someone who's not in that discipline may not know what that means. So those are just some examples of using jargon or specific language to that field. Remember, they're not writing for you or for me in these articles. They're writing for other experts. They're often lengthy also. A good article is usually between 10 and 15 pages, sometimes longer depending on the extent of the study, what the person is trying to accomplish. So just keep that in mind as well. Like, I'm in a doctorate program now, and most of the papers that I'm writing are 10 pages or more. And that's without that, and that's me doing a quick study in an 8-week course. So imagine someone doing something longer. That's why they just have so much data that they've collected, and they've had to weed through it and decide what's the most important. They also use a lot of long sentences with augmented vocabulary. So it's not even just the jargon. It's also just big words in general, because that's, what's expected from an academic. So just be prepared to look up a lot of words while you're reading these. I still look up a lot of words while I'm reading these, and I've been doing this a very long time, especially if it's something I'm not familiar with. So those are just some of the challenges. There are others, but those are the big ones. When you're choosing articles, so we went over how to use the library databases, hopefully, unless you're watching this in advance of that class session. But choosing the articles, aside from the actual process of finding them, is picking articles that are relevant to your topic, which might actually be part of the challenge of using these, is figuring out if the article is going to work for you. You want to make sure you're reading the abstracts. You want to preview the article, skim through it a little bit before you decide, yes, I want to use this one. Background check the author. Some of the articles might have a little blurb about the author in them, but not all of them will. You also want to determine the journal in which the article was published. Look at that. That might tell you something about it. So like I said, if I send an article to, Journal of Higher Education, like that's a pretty good indicator that that journal is going to be about higher education, but it's going to be very broad. There's also very specific journals. I remember when I was in grad school for my master's, we used like Shakespeare Quarterly. So there's a journal entirely dedicated just to Shakespeare. I'm pretty sure there's one for Hemingway. There's some for James Joyce. There's some for like African American literature. There's some for European literature. So there's an entire spectrum of broad and specific journals that you'll find. So just be careful with that. Make sure that the journal is fitting into your topic. One we looked at in a class I just taught was bioethics. That's very specific, but also covers a lot of things, right? So determine the journal in which it was published. That will tell you something about where that article fits in context. And then look at titles and subtitles. So this is a good way to preview the article. Obviously look at the title of the article. It may be long or short. Sometimes there's a short title with a really long subtitle. Sometimes it's just a really long title. And then look at the subtitles throughout the article. So if you have an article that says something, has subheadings like methods, findings, results, discussion, that's going to be an empirical study, whereas something that has maybe Roman numerals might not be an empirical study. Sometimes the subheadings will be very specific to the study. So just be aware of what the subtitles are doing, and they'll tell you what kind of article you're looking at. The next thing you want to do is look at the introduction and conclusion. Sometimes there will be a specific conclusion. Sometimes it'll just be lumped in as part of the discussion, depending on what type of article it is. But if you look at those two first, that's going to give you another good idea about what is sandwiched between those two things in the article. You can read those a little bit quickly before you decide if the content of the article is going to be helpful for you. What I do, if I'm reading something that I'm really struggling with, is I'll summarize it as I go. I'll summarize the introduction and the conclusion in a couple of sentences so that I have an idea to remind myself what this article is going to be about. So we have some main points from the abstract, right? You have the intro, the conclusion. You also want to determine the thesis, which should usually be clear in the introduction. However, it may not be like we do a thesis where I say it needs to be explicitly stated at the end of the introduction. It might be towards the beginning of the introduction. The introduction is probably going to be more than one paragraph. So just keep that in mind too. It also might not be a specific sentence that you can pinpoint as the thesis. It might be implied or implicit. So that's what you want to identify as well. Is it an implied thesis or is it an explicit thesis? So once you have all of that done, you have your introduction, right? You have your conclusion. You've determined the thesis, whether it's implied or explicit. Then you can go section by section. As you're starting out, I recommend just reading one section at a time and summarizing as you go. And then that way you kind of create your own spark notes, for lack of a better term, your own summaries of the article, so you don't have to keep rereading them. Highlighting is good, but sometimes we don't remember why we highlighted, especially when you're just starting out. So like for me, I highlight things that I think are important, but because I have to read such a high volume of things, I try to highlight what I think is the main idea of every paragraph. So if I need to go back to that article, I can just look at those highlights and see what's the most important thing from every paragraph and just read those rather than reading the entire paper again. So look at those sections. It might be by subtitles. It might be by process, which is that, methods, results, discussion, all of that. Look at the sections and then see how the paragraphs fit into that section. So if we're talking about methods, the methods are going to be how they conducted the study. So when I write a study, I talk about my methods are, qualitative interviewing, document collection, things like that. Then you can kind of go paragraph by paragraph. Once you've identified each section, if you find even the sections are overwhelming, you can look at just one paragraph at a time and try to figure out what that paragraph is trying to say. You'll always usually have a topic sentence followed by some kind of elaboration on that topic sentence. So even if it just helps you as you're skimming that article, read the topic sentences first, then go back and read the rest, you can do that. You can make an outline of paraphrased topic sentences, and that'll give you a general gist of that. We call that reverse outlining, which I'll go into a little bit more on the next slide. And then use keywords and bullet points to summarize as you're going. And that's a lot of what I do when I'm reading, is that I'll pull a key idea or a keyword out of that paragraph and just write it next to the paragraph, so that when I'm writing the paper or doing a discussion post or something like that, I can just go back and see where those keywords are so I know what I'm looking for. Okay, reverse outlining. This was actually something I learned in graduate school that helped me really understand articles and see them at a glance. You can also do it as a concept map, which is the graphic that I have on this slide, where you start with the main point and then you kind of branch out and do it from there. If you're more of a visual person, feel free to use the concept map instead of a reverse outline. I'm a linear thinker. I like things very neat and organized, very type A. But basically, a reverse outline is doing an outline of something that's already written. So this is something you can use to help you understand the articles. You can also use it when you're trying to figure out the organization of a draft that you wrote. But for today, we're going to focus on articles. I use the Roman numeral outline style, as you all know, from the outline template. You don't want to use that outline template for this because that's very specific to how I want you to write your paper. This, you're just going to kind of go through and identify the sections and then the paragraphs and kind of what the main ideas are. This is just so you can see the article at a glance, and you can go back and keep adding to it as you read it. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about is critical reading. So we've talked about critical reading before. There's a whole nother lecture on this, but you want to keep your reverse outline near you as you go back and review the article. If you're really not comprehending do the reverse outline first as you go through it the first time, and then read it again, and then that will help you make those connections. Look up words you don't know, mark them, just like you would if you were reading anything else that you didn't understand. Add your comments, your judgments, evaluations, your questions about things you don't understand. If the whole article is just way over your head, and that happens to all of us, just pick a different one. I don't think that it's worth you struggling through the article to be able to use it. Even if it seems good, if you don't understand what's going on, then it's not going to be useful for you. I've had to do that before, where there's articles that are just full of statistical, mathematical stuff, and I just don't understand it. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe this is not the right article for my topic. So just keep that in mind when you're reading. If you're in the first couple of paragraphs and it's not making sense, might be time to find something else. And that's why I don't suggest printing them right away. Don't print them if you want to print them. Don't print them until you definitely know you're going to use it. Kind of just skim through it on the computer first. But do make sure that you are reading them critically, that you're writing down notes, that you're annotating them, just like you would anything else that you're reading. All right. Just to wrap up the article, when you're done, try to talk about it with somebody, either me or a writing center tutor or a friend that's working with a topic or a friend that's not working with the topic and you just want to chat about it. Even if you're just making notes to yourself, or what I do sometimes, if nobody else is writing about what I'm writing about, I'll just write a little reflection after I'm done reading it, just a paragraph or so, about what I thought about the article, what I thought about the ideas in the article. And I think that helps me keep track of how I feel about them, and also what my reactions were, so that when I go to write the paper, after I've read 10 articles, I may not remember the first one I read that well, and then I have that little reflection in my notes. Also choose sections or quotes that are helpful for you for your project. That's really what I recommend highlighting, is highlighting any quotes you think you're going to use or passages that are going to be helpful for you. Don't over highlight, just like we talked about in critical reading. Over highlighting becomes a problem because then you highlight everything and then nothing's important. So choose carefully what you want to highlight or underline. I like to use little stars sometimes. It depends. Sometimes I'll highlight a bunch of things and star things that are extra important. You'll find your strategy for annotating as you go. You also, again, because these are challenging, you may have to reread them, not right away, but that's why it's important to keep those annotations, because that'll prevent you from having to reread the whole thing. You can just read your annotations. Okay, so I know it's a lot of information, but the best way to learn how to do this is just to practice. These are just tips. You don't have to do it this way, but I like to give you some strategies to help you learn how to break these down. And again, these are written for and by experts, so it's going to take you a little bit of time to get used to it. Once you're used to it, though, then it won't be as daunting. Follow the steps, follow the tips, figure out what process works best for you. Take into account all the stuff we talked about with critical reading, and take your time. There's no rush. Rushing through them is going to end up being a waste of your time because you're not going to remember anything. It's better to take your time and do a little bit at a time as you get used to it. And then, you can sit down and read a whole article maybe one day. I still can't. I've been doing this since I'm 18. So at this time of recording, 12 years I've been reading scholarly articles, and I still have to not always read them in one sitting. Depending on how long they're. If they're longer than like 15 pages, I usually cannot do it in one sitting. I have to take a break, or I have to pick it back up tomorrow or whatever. Because it's a lot of information to digest. And that's why, I suggest breaking it down. So don't be afraid. Don't be daunted. Take your time. Don't wait till the last minute. This is not something, if you're in a class where we do an annotated bibliography, you don't want to wait till the last minute to do that. Not all classes have that, but if you're doing that, you want to make sure that you are starting right away. Quick to start, slow to finish. Okay? Take your time, get them done, understand them. If you don't understand it, just get a different one. There's plenty out there, plenty of information out there. So if you have questions about it or you're not sure about an article, feel free to send it to me and I'll let you know if it's something that's doable or not for your topic. And that is about it. So I will see you in class. Good luck with your articles. and enjoy them.